Well, with that State of the Nation address by President Cyril Ramaphosa tomorrow, it's a good moment to have a look at our state of the nation, what we need to do about it. If you look around you, there does appear to be more evidence that our country is becoming more divided. I think it's fair to say the ANC looks more divided too. At the same time, the demands for accountability and for action to resolve our problems is growing. Professor Gouws is a distinguished professor in political science at the University of Stellenbosch. Shenilla Mohamed is executive director at Amnesty International. Thank you both for joining us. I really do appreciate it. Professor Gouws, if I may start with you. I think over the years it's been easier to say that the State of Nation address has become more and more difficult. Would it be true to say our country now, February 2022, is in a worse position than it was in February 2019, February 2020, and last year, February 2021?
Yes, and I think that is a sad state of affairs if we think that we've had between 2020 and 21 the issue of the pandemic to deal with. But this State of the Nation address comes on the back of the insurrection that we've seen in KwaZulu-Natal that's put a huge dent into the economy. We've just seen the release of the Zondo Commission report that will actually ask for some action on part of the President for the implementation of the recommendations. We're back to load shedding last week, which means that Eskom is not functioning as it should, and it's actually requiring a 20% increase that will have a very direct impact on the consumer, and so will the skyrocketing petrol price. This together with, I think, this unity in the ANC and the attacks on the judiciary and the very dismal interviews that we've seen with the Judicial Services Commission last week for the appointment of the Chief Justice is just a dismal state of affairs. And in between all of this, the President now needs to find a space to say something to actually inspire trust in the population, and at the same time do not put his foot into some of these factional fights of the ANC.
Well, I suppose in the real world, Professor, we have to ask the question, what can President Ramaphosa do about any of this? I think some people feel now that he can actually do virtually nothing. I don't think that's necessarily correct, but certainly there's a lot of cynicism around this address.
Yes, well, I think, the one thing that he will need to say something is about economic recovery. And at the moment, we are servicing our debt at 303 billion rand per year. So that's about R1 billion a day, because we are spending more than we are actually getting back. And to say that there will be job creation in these conditions is very problematic. And we know then, therefore, the President will also have to say something about the issue of a basic income grant. So he can say and he can make promises. He can, for example, say that he will put resources towards the National Prosecuting Authority to prosecute some of the offenders that's named in the Zondo report. But the problem literally is that there is no money. And so service delivery is suffering because of a lack of money. And so will all these reports that need to be actually taken care of in terms of implementation, because there's just no money.
Shenilla Mohamed, I mean, you've just heard Professor Gouws make the point there's no money. From your statements, you're suggesting there's no accountability either. That's what you want to see.
Well, I think that, one of the reasons that there is no money is that there's no accountability. And, again, the President needs to take, I think as the Professor says that, he can make promises, but I think that time is totally past now. What the President needs to do is show the nation that he himself is accountable and that he will ensure that, that his cabinet and all the government officials are accountable. And the first thing towards that, Stephen, is he needs to share with us an action plan or, a plan as to how to hold those who have been found guilty of corruption or have not been doing their jobs. How are they going to be held to account? And I think that's got to be the starting point. So, the problem that we're facing is that people are being allowed to get away with corruption, with theft of money, with just not doing their jobs. And I think the South African public is really tired, and unless he talks very, very loudly and clearly about what actions he's going to put into place to hold those that have been found guilty to account, I don't think the nation is going to trust him or his government.
And I mean, Shenilla, it's not just about accountability. I mean, it's so many people with political power. I mean, we can talk about the national level. We can talk about the claims that have been made against people who will be in the room tomorrow, literally in the hall. Some of them very close to the president in terms of their political and their physical proximity, where they'll actually be sitting. But it's also local government, isn't it, Shenilla Mohamed? I mean, we see this lack of accountability everywhere.
Well, I think the sad thing, Stephen, is that it's at every level where the state operates. And, you know, there is no, and if you look at the Auditor General's report, I mean, it was a horrible indictment of the situation. I think there were like 47 out of 257 or something. I may have the figures wrong, but a small percentage of, municipalities that had a clean audit. Now, what does that mean? It means the bulk of them are either mismanaging or that they are seeped in corruption. So the president has to tell us how he's going to fix this. I mean, we have gender-based violence. We talked about funds. We talked about money. We talked about, all sorts of things. And yet the situation continues. 20 million people in this country have no access to clean water, drinking water. There are 15 million people who have no access to sanitation. Children still have to use pit latrines in their schools. So, we were already in a bad situation. We then had COVID. And if you compound that with corruption and the lack of accountability, then as the professor says, we are in a very, very bad situation because, the money is gone now. The problems are huge. And unless the president can deliver a plan of action, I think South Africa is heading for lots of trouble going forward.
Professor Gouws, I mean, over the years, there's been this idea of expectation ahead of the State of the Nation address. And I think correctly so. It's a big moment. It's a big moment in other democracies too. And yet, I think towards the end of the Zuma era, particularly as the situation in the ANC became so close, it seemed that they were often quite bland. I realize I'm probably going to trend in certain parts of Twitter for saying that. But is there a risk that because of what's happening in the ANC, the president may be tempted to keep his quite bland tomorrow? If he does that, surely there'll be consequences.
Yes, well, I think a superficial and pedestrian State of the Nation address will be the last nail in the coffin for his run as for a second term. So we shouldn't forget that at the end of the year, there's the elective conference of the ANC where they need to choose a new president for the ANC. And this State of the Nation address may be the making or the breaking of Cyril Ramaphosa. And then we have to face a situation that we don't know who will take over from him. And will it necessarily be a person who can do better than Cyril Ramaphosa? I think we're all sort of in a state of really deep worry about the state of South Africa, but also the state of the ANC, because the biggest problem to good governance now has become the ANC itself.
Well, I mean, this is the issue, isn't it? I mean, if he goes far in one direction, Professor, is he taking a risk? If he does nothing, he's taking a risk. If he goes far in another direction, he's taking a risk.
Yeah. That's absolutely the case. And, so now while the population has more or less lost trust in all the arms of government. We've done a study on trust in the different institutions, and the only institution that still has a lot of trust is the Constitutional Court. So political parties, government, and so on, people don't trust them anymore. And once a government loses trust, it's very difficult to regain it.
Shenilla Mohamed, I mean, in a way, accountability is about human rights. In other words, you can only have a right if there is accountability for someone who infringes that right. If someone physically assaults you, you have a right not to be assaulted. There needs to be accountability for what happened. What I'm trying to get to is that in what seems to be a state with less accountability, it's less constitutional, the rule of law matters less. And I think there's plenty of evidence that that's what's happening.
That's absolutely, Stephen. I mean, economic, social, cultural rights are human rights. So when we fail to deliver on those, we are really basically depriving people of their basic human rights and their dignity. I mean, everybody has a right to water. Everybody has a right to live in dignity. I mean, last year during COVID, we ran a campaign on water, and we were absolutely astounded that, many South Africans thought that water was a privilege and not a right, yet it is enshrined in the Constitution. And so, I think absolutely, the failure by the state to deliver basic essential services, they are depriving people who live in South Africa of their basic rights. And I think that, that in itself is an indictment on the present government. And I think, what President Ramaphosa needs to do, to be frank, is that he needs to stop trying to keep everybody happy and put South Africa at the forefront of everything. And I think what we're seeing now is that with this political dance that's going on, actually people's basic human rights and the country is slipping further and further downwards. And it's very difficult to pull it out once it falls into that state, because the inequalities in this country were huge to start off with. The poverty levels were high, and now to try to, bridge those, what you're seeing is more and more anger that is brewing. And I think that, South Africa is a country that will explode if inequality, poverty is not dealt with. And as the professor says, the money is gone. So what is the plan, President Ramaphosa? How are you going to deliver on what is enshrined in the Constitution and what you have signed up to deliver? And that's what we want to see from him tomorrow.
It's interesting, Professor Gouws, because I think everybody demands that the president take action. But if the president took the action that all of those people demanded, it would be completely contradictory, wouldn't it? I mean, and this is the problem with the divided society.
Yeah, that is absolutely the problem. So I think we're going to hear evergreens, right? Some economic stimulus package, some placation of saying, yeah, maybe we'll get a basic income grant. We have to fix infrastructure and so on. And we hear that every SONA, we hear these promises. And just to come back to gender-based violence, for example, last year there were the promises made that there will be, that the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence will be implemented, that large amounts of money will be put towards the implementation. So here we are a year later, and there's very limited evidence of the implementation. We've passed 3 amendment acts through Parliament that will help on a legal, a legislative level, will help with the problem. But there's really no efforts to deal with the problem head on, preventative measures and so on. So I think that if we think about people sitting down at the televisions tomorrow night and looking at the State of the Nation address, will they even think that any of those promises that will be made will anything come of it? But more so, I think that what the president needs to do is to, just set aside all these issues and say, this is the state of the nation. It's really bad. And this is what we as the ANC, looking into our own house. How are we going to clean out our house and then, provide for the population? Unless he does that and he looks a little bit enthusiastic about action, I don't know if anybody's going to believe anything.
In a way, one of the biggest problems is the expectation deficit, if we can call it, around President Cyril Ramaphosa, perhaps. Professor Amanda Gouws, thank you, a distinguished professor of political science at the University of Stellenbosch. Shenilla, Mohamed, the executive director of Amnesty International South Africa. Southern Africa, I really do appreciate the time.